To welcome everybody to the third in this series of Faraday seminars. For the sake of the online video and those listening by audio, perhaps I can introduce myself. I'm Dennis Alexander, the director of the Faraday Institute, and we'd like to welcome everybody here to the third in this series. Before introducing our speaker for today, I'd like to just make a couple of practical announcements, which I make each time. But one is, if you have a mobile phone which is switched on, would you perhaps switch it off now, even if it's just on standby, because the sound is picked up by these very sensitive microphones we have here in the system, so that would be very helpful. We also have a growing number of DVDs and CDs for sale of the previous Faraday seminars. They're at the back. They're at a real knockdown price, especially discounted for those who make it up to the tower and come for these seminars. So you can buy a DVD for £4 of either John Polkinghorne's talk or indeed Philip Clayton's from 2 weeks ago, or a CD for only £2. So these are cheap enough to buy and give away friends, relatives, aunts, people for Christmas and so forth. So please do take advantage of that rather good offer. And then I'd also like to remind you that the last in our present series of these seminars will be in 2 weeks' time, when Sir Brian Heap will be speaking on the subject of consumption and well-being, Christian values and sustainability. So that's on 14th of March, 2 weeks' time. Now, today we welcome Professor Colin Russell, who had a distinguished career in chemistry before moving moreover into the area of the history of science. Professor Russell is the Emeritus Professor of the History of Science and Technology from the Open University, where he was formerly head of the department there, and he's currently a research scholar affiliated to the History and Philosophy of Science department here in Cambridge. Professor Russell was also formerly president of the British Society for the History of Science. Now, given the name of our new institute, we're especially delighted in the topic that we have today, which is Science and Faith in the Life of Michael Faraday. So, over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Dennis. We have had one or two technical difficulties before starting, and if I do not slip up over this cable, it will be a miracle. But we will do our best. I'm reminded of the bishop and the sound amplification system. You know the story, perhaps you don't. The bishop was conducting a service of communion, I think it was, in a church where he'd never been before, where they had a new sound amplification system. Next to him was his curate, chaplain. And standing up somewhat nervously, he, as people do if they're amateurs, tapped the microphone to see if it made a noise. He didn't hear anything. So, in fact, the microphone was on, but he didn't realise that. So all the subsequent conversation was relayed to the congregation. And he said to his chaplain, "There's something wrong with this thing." And the congregation, as one man said, and also with you. Now, it's a great privilege to be able to speak about Faraday and his theology, and to talk about the way in which science and faith related in his life. Now, the relationships between science and faith, science and religion, are complex and varied. People have spoken at length about the conflict between science and religion, a thesis which is now historically pretty well in tatters, but you still get it in the press, of course. It's good press coverage, good media stuff. There's the view, perhaps a little more popular today, that science and faith are absolutely separate. They may exist in the same person, but there's some sort of impermeable membrane in his brain, so that one doesn't get across to the other. And that is a view that some people seem to hold. And there's, of course, a much more recent view of symbiosis, that science and religion do, in fact, in some ways, cross-fertilize each other. But the relationship is so fraught with complexities, with ambiguities, and with complicated relations with other things, like politics and society, that some historians have given up and said it's just too complicated to generalize. Which is one reason why it's very good to look at a case of Michael Faraday. Indeed, at any case, because as you look at an individual person, it is possible to avoid a lot of generalities. And Faraday, of all scientists, has been much studied. In fact, he's been more studied than any other scientist since science began. There are more books about Faraday than about Einstein, about Newton, and about everyone, almost anyone, I think literally anyone else you can think of. And a very considerable piece of research was done by Geoffrey Cantor of the University of Leeds on Faraday's religion, and I am much indebted to a lot of what Geoffrey said. Now, there is a danger when we talk about religion, science and faith in the life of anybody, that first of all that we read into it, or her, our own prejudices and preconceptions. And I'm going to try as hard as I possibly can not to do that. There's also the danger that we look at the person in the light of our own day rather than the days in which he lived or she lived. The danger of presentism is a very big one, and that again we are going to try and avoid. Now, I'm going to pass over entirely all the details of the great scientific achievements of this giant, because this audience will surely know most of them. Great foundation work in electromagnetism, he was working in electrochemistry, field theory, gave the basis for the dynamo and indeed probably the electric motor as well. His chemical work was very considerable, and in many other ways Faraday was a giant among men. But I'm not going to talk about that, because I think it's going to be much more interesting if we look, as we discuss this man, at the roots of his belief. And those roots go back very far and very deeply. Faraday once said, "I am a member of a very small and despised sect of Christians known, if known at all, as Sandemanians, and our hope is founded on the faith that is in Christ." And as we try to see what that means, I want to do something which you probably didn't expect. I want to go back into the social history of this sect and to see the theology in its social and indeed even in its physical context. Faraday embraced the faith of his parents, who had been brought up in a remote corner of England, far, far from here, up in what is now Cumbria, wild, desolate country, and there his parents lived, and there the Sandemanian faith flourished. He embraced this faith, and it was to have profound effects on every department of his life. It permeated his family up and far beyond his birth. This particular faith was actually founded by a Presbyterian minister who'd been unfrocked, if that's what they do in Scotland. Anyway, he'd been dismissed, a man called John Glass, in 1724, and it was promoted by the much weightier writings of Glass's son-in-law, Robert Sandeman, and it was a search for the primitive Christianity disclosed in the New Testament. And we'll see about it in a moment, but from about 1760 it flourished in certain parts of Scotland and in certain parts of England, particularly the part where the Faradays lived. The Faraday family had a long tradition of religious dissent. In the early 18th century, a Robert Faraday worked in a small estate in the northwest tip of what is now Yorkshire, near Clapham. He was what we would call an estate manager in modern jargon, and his forebears came from the coast. But he settled there and became a Sandemanian, and in due course settled at that place and lived and worshipped in this little chapel, which is still there. There's a private house at Wenning Bank. That was a Sandemanian chapel. Now, the Sandemanian faith was a very simple one in many ways, with its appeal to biblical authority, its very high ethical demands, its concern for unity. It had some interesting, we would call primitive ideas, practices. Every Sunday they would wash each other's feet, which I suppose in that part of the world is no bad thing, but that was a theological rather than a physical thing. And every member staunchly maintained his faith by ethical conduct and in theological belief. And even in such bizarre things as this. What are you going to call your children? Well, you don't have to think about it. It's all fixed. And I have looked at Faraday's genealogy in great detail, and there isn't a single exception to this. Doesn't derive from the New Testament, it derives from the Scottish culture in which glass first worked. But your son or daughter are named according to that pattern, and it's rigid. Now, I mentioned that it's slightly amusing, and it's of no great significance, except that it just shows, since it's always observed, how strong the binding was within the community. Now, this community of Sandemanians had a great sense of solidarity, they had a great sense of security, and security was one of the things you look for in that part of the world. It's a wild, desolate area, 50 miles from the nearest city. Nature is red in tooth and claw, though that's not the phrase they would have used, and certainly a howling wind that comes down occasionally, called the helm, from the top of Wild Boar Fell, to this very day can rip off the roof of a barn or a farmhouse in seconds. And it is really desolate, wild country. And within their family and within their church, they found a security that was surely, at least in part, a reflection of the insecure time in which they lived. And also, of course, their memories would go back to the century before, when the whole area was devastated by the Scots coming over the border, known as reivers, who would come in search of pillage, rape, murder, and when they retreated the next day, the families that had suffered were known as the families who had been bereaved, which is the origin of that word. And that didn't happen in Faraday's day, but it certainly happened in a few generations before, and the memory will be there. So, security was important. Now, this sect, just lastly, before we proceed in another direction, was strongly evangelical. It was also strongly Calvinist. And for that reason, they did not evangelize. I think they thought that was God's job. And such evangelism as they did was limited to written word and letter. But also, it was a very inward-looking group of people. It was subject to schism and dissent and eventually decline. It had, in fact, the seeds of its own decay. It would have nothing to do, formally, with other Christian groups. It was a dissenting sect in the most literal sense of the word. And in fact, the last elders in this church were ordained in 1967. Anyway, go back to the Faradays. Robert's son, James, became a blacksmith. And his house was in a little hamlet called Uthgill, on the site of this one, which is Faraday Cottage, and on the Drove Road from Scotland to London. And as a blacksmith, he would have plenty of opportunity of exercising his trade. Across the valley, quite a narrow valley, the Eden Valley, there lies this house, which is just the same as it was in those days. Deepgill Farm, and in Deepgill Farm there lived a very handsome young lady who, like James, was a Sandemanian. They courted, they married in 1786, and these two were to become the parents of Michael Faraday. James Faraday and Margaret Hastwell. She too, as I say, had a Sandemanian upbringing, and her parents came from what is now a ruin, overlooked by nothing except a solitary cow on the horizon, Black Scar Farm, and that's where the mother of Michael Faraday was born. Well, they had two children, and a third was on the way, when for some reason, it's not clear, they moved to London. And there, the one that was on the way duly appeared in September 1791, and he was, of course, named after his mother's father. He was named Michael, because he was the second son. The first son was Robert, named after the same formula. Now I'm going to pass over all the early years of penury and limited schooling. He was apprenticed to a bookkeeper, and he made valiant attempts at self-education, introduced himself to Humphrey Davy, and he became eventually Davy's assistant, Davy's stooge first of all, Davy's assistant, and then he became Professor of Chemistry after many years at the Royal Institution. And since 1816, that's where Faraday lived, high up in the building, free from unwelcome intrusions. And during that time, the Faradays would pursue their Sandemanian faith. They went to a little chapel in Paul's Alley, and there every Sunday they would go to the main morning service, which lasted 3 hours. But that was preceded by another one, which lasted also 3 hours, and followed by another one, which lasted 3 hours. So in all, they had a bit of a marathon. But after that, there was time to fraternize, to meet with other fellow Sandemanians, and the bonding in that community, according to all that Faraday has written, was quite incredible. Among the younger members of the congregation in St. Paul's Abbey was a fine upstanding young lady called Sarah Barnard, whose father was a silversmith, and who was also a Sandemanian, member of an old Sandemanian family actually, and she was a fine-looking lass. And Michael Faraday at first would have nothing to do with concepts of marriage, but as many of us have found, in due course, one's concepts change, and he courted her successfully. And they were married, and no children were born, but they were married in June 1821. They had to go to an Anglican church, because that's where marriage was legalized in those days. But there was no service, merely a signing of the register. Some faith in the city of London. Now, within 2 days of the wedding, Michael Faraday actually joined the Sandemanian church, which his wife had joined 2 years previously. Maybe their marriage precipitated him into action, but Sarah asked him why he'd done it, and his reply was memorable. He said simply, "That is between me and my God." Now, a man whose faith is so secret as that is not a man who's likely to wear his heart on his sleeve. And if he wouldn't tell his wife why he did certain things religiously, he's not likely to tell us. But that was, in a sense, the natural conclusion to a process which had begun in childhood, and it meant a very great deal to Michael Faraday. And so I pass over the blissful years of their early marriage when, although they had no children, the house of the Royal Institution was often overrun by nephews and nieces, and Faraday was a great person with small children. He would cycle on a primitive tricycle round the great circle surrounding the Lecture Theatre, the RI is still there. And Michael Faraday would do that, pursued by, or pursuing, screaming children with great delight. So, there we go. So what we need to do is to ask how this faith, the faith that was nourished in circumstances like that, wild, remote areas, how it reacted with Faraday's science. How can we find out? Well, there are two possible models which I'll put before you, but we can find out, I think, mainly from very private letters that Faraday wrote, many of which have been published, and also by various memoranda he wrote to himself, reminding him about this and that. Also, strangely enough, a couple of Bibles that he owned have survived, and they have been incredibly well marked and annotated. And this sort of information can help us to see something more of his faith, and indeed, if it actually affected his science. Well, as I say, there are two possible models that I want to put before you. The first one is a divergent model, but just let me mention, this is the Sandemanian chapel where Faraday's parents worshipped in Kirkby Stephen, the thing at the end of that little passage. It's now a furniture warehouse, but that's it still, and it still has a chapel might look about it, and that was in Kirby Steve. But let's look at these two models. The first one is the conventional view. There is a great gulf fixed between science and faith in Faraday, and never the twain shall meet. Two quite different worlds. Let's hear what Faraday himself had to say. He once, in answer to an inquiry, said this: "There is no philosophy, that means science, in my religion. Though the natural works of God can never by any possibility come in contradiction with the higher things that belong to our future existence, and must with everything concerning him ever glorify him, still I do not think it at all necessary to tie the study of natural science and religion together. And in my intercourse with fellow creatures, that which is religious and that which is philosophical and scientific have ever been two distinct things." That's pretty clear, isn't it? Sir John Murray Thomas, in his delightful biography of Faraday, I'm glad he's here today, able won't mind me quoting him, puts it very well. He says that serene in the security of his religious conviction, Faraday was untroubled by the apparent conflict between science and religious belief. Resolute in his pursuit of excellence as a lecturer and dedicated to the attainment of the highest standards at the RI in Albemarle Street, he accepted with equanimity the primitive theological pronouncements of his fellow worshippers in the Paul's Alley meeting house off Aldersgate Street. In other words, scientific practice was kept quite separate from his religious conviction. And the picture is that of separation, this impermeable membrane. Now, Geoffrey Cantor put it in a different way. He says this: "When Faraday descends from the private world of his home to the public world of his lectures, a mask slips over his face. For here he is not at home, and here he has to encounter values that are alien to those of Sandemanianism. It's not particularly remarkable. Every lecture, big public lecture, the RI and other places, has something of the theatre about it. But the suggestion of a theatre in Faraday is quite an interesting one, and suggests that he is actually trying to be two people, the real Faraday and Faraday wearing a mask. But there is another element of Cantor's analysis which I think is perhaps more helpful, not one of separation, but one of selectivity. He says that in the public domain of the RI, Faraday avoided those aspects of the mundane world which were inimical to his Sandemanianism. And it's certainly the case that things that we might have thought controversial in those days, and were controversial, like the age of the earth, like the date of the flood, this is of course before Darwin, and other issues of that kind, they might have been matters of problem. Faraday never mentioned them. He avoided them. Now, whether he avoided them because they cause problems, or simply because they were a long way from his immediate projects, I don't know. But he does seem to have been very selective, and in his science and the things he worked at scientifically were those which didn't seem to have much theological implication. So, either in separation or in selectivity, his religion could be seen as divergent from his science. But why? Well, I think there are two possible reasons. One is, I think he was probably reacting against romantic idealism. This was a movement which owed much to German natural philosophy, which stressed the unity of all things, the ability of human beings to come to conclusions about the whole total world, which is a sort of Gestalt view, a view reflected in the work of Humphrey Davy, pictured there in that famous Gilray cartoon at the Royal Institution. And Davy, of course, was a man who brought electricity and chemistry together in a unity that no man had ever thought of before. He was the founder of electrochemistry. And he was a great friend of Wordsworth, another representative of the Romantic tradition. And in the romantic idealism of Davy and Wordsworth, there were things which were of value to Faraday, but there were things that were utterly abhorrent to him. Where the unity of Romanticism was applied to link God and man, leading ultimately to a kind of pantheism, or to God and the universe, Faraday's Sandemanian faith rose up in disbelief. And the romantic emphasis on intuition as a route to truth was totally incompatible with Faraday's view of the understanding of truth either through the Bible or through experiment. And there is no doubt that he reacted against those things. And that may be one reason why he kept his science and his religion separate. There's another, more obvious reason, and that is natural theology, especially a British phenomenon which associated with William Paley, the Bridgewater treatises and so on, and going back indeed to the Boyle lectures. This natural theology, from nature up to nature's God, was very popular in the early 19th century, but not with Faraday. And amongst many evangelicals at that time and later, it backfired because it seemed to place reason above revelation. It seemed to say you can find God in nature, you don't need to look at his revealed truth. Nature above scripture. I think putting it as Faraday would have put it. So when he famously announced there's no philosophy in my religion, what he was saying is that scientific knowledge could not illumine religion or lead men to God. So there was this separation in Faraday's mind between science and religion, so it would appear. A divergent model has much to commend it. But when all this is recognized, there are various problems that remain. Strong evidence suggests that Faraday cannot have meant that there's no connection at all between scientific and religious truth. And as Pierce Williams, one of his best biographers, puts it, his deepest intuitions about the physical world sprang from his religious faith in the divine origin of nature. We can go even further than that and see how that same faith gave meaning and purpose to his whole life, scientific and otherwise. One of his great friends, an agnostic, famous John Tyndall physicist, also employed at the Royal Institution, recognized that Faraday's religious feeling and his philosophy could not be kept apart. So here we have evidence for a different model. And I come now to a convergent model, in which it seems that other evidence suggests that religion and science, faith and science, did converge in the case of Michael Faraday. And I want to give you 5 illustrations, well, more than 5 main illustrations of that. And the first one is in his vocation to science. Now, as a young apprentice, Faraday was deeply dissatisfied. He was apprenticed to a bookbinder in London, and although he acquired bookbinding skills of a high order, they weren't going to fulfill his deep urges to find more out about the world in which he lived, to react in a truly Sandemanian way to truth in all its forms. And working in an environment with books all around him, he wanted to learn from the sources, from, in fact, the experimental facts and data in the laboratory. And although he didn't put it like this, it was as though Sandemanian and science could be twin partners in an enterprise that had been recommended long ago by Francis Bacon, who spoke of 2 books, of scripture and of nature. And many years later, in fact, Faraday himself actually said that he studied the book of nature that was written by the finger of God. There was a strange isomorphism between Faraday's faith and Faraday's science. And only a convergent model can really accommodate this. Now, when we consider more of his vocation to science, we have to face the fact that Faraday had superb experimental skills. I find it very hard to relate those to his theology, but not impossible. They probably derive from the manipulative abilities of his blacksmith father, and Faraday was often talking nostalgically about the noise of the blacksmith's forge and the tools dropping on the floor and all those things, and how he loved the manipulation of the iron. And certainly his training at the bookbinders would have helped him in another direction with his fingers. In fact, John Tyndall said, Michael Faraday is the greatest experimental philosopher the world has ever seen. Not my view, that's the view of John Tyndall, who certainly didn't agree with Faraday's theology. But there was a general sense in which Sandemanianism did encourage the manual arts. Many of the members worked with their hands and with their fingers. And also it did encourage a spirit of real intellectual inquiry, and it also encouraged a sense of great perseverance, which was a virtue that it commended. But that's just one small thing. His vocation to science, I believe, owed something, probably quite a lot, to the faith that he had. But secondly, the concept of science. Now, this is where we are getting onto very thin ice. Some years ago, I was asked to give a talk at a conference in Canada on how chemistry, which is my subject, had been affected by theology and how chemical concepts reflected theological doctrines. And I said, I don't think there are any in modern chemistry. And I went to the conference and I actually said that. And it was greatly shocked. They were greatly shocked. And in fact, mine was the only paper that wasn't published because it was so subversive. And in point of fact, I think it was true. I can find no cases of modern chemistry that have the remotest connection with theology. And in talking about concepts of science and theology, we usually have to go back much further. Certainly Newton and Boyle and others clearly and demonstrably shaped their science, partly for theological reasons, not entirely, but partly. So, is there a connection between metaphysical beliefs and the cognitive areas of science? It is difficult, and yet, there are two cases with Faraday where I think such links are actually demonstrable. The first one is in field theories. For many years, Faraday had been pursuing doggedly his inquiries into current electricity and into magnetism. He'd been dogged by questions as to how electric and magnetic influences could be transmitted. Two kinds of fairly common kinds of explanation were available. One of material action, like those of John Dalton, where each ball hits another ball, and like falling dominoes, you get direct action. The other was the old doctrine of action at a distance, where they're attracted to one another without any intermediate bodies to pass the effects down the chain. And Faraday came to a version of the theory that is more related to the latter than the former. This was his theory of fields, which were some kind of mechanical agencies to transport energy across a space, across a distance. Possibly he was indebted to the Italian, 18th century Italian, Moscovich, but certainly there were other secular impacts on his scientific thought processes. And that might have been the end of the story, nothing to do with theology. And then some years ago, Trevor Levere discovered in the library of the Institute of Electrical Engineers a private memorandum by Faraday which had never been published, never seen the light of day. It was written for himself only to clarify his own ideas on atoms and fields. And unlike his published papers, it contains several references to God, one of which wondered whether God could not as easily put power round point centres as he could about material atomic nuclei. A query that he asked himself, couldn't God do this just as easily? And his theology of an all-powerful God encouraged him to the ideas of point centres. And Levere has developed this in a paper published some years ago now, and concluded that these ideas, new ideas of theory, fitted in with the world picture imposed by his religion. And indeed, another commentator, again no religious axe to grind, as Maurice Berman, who wrote about the Royal Institution, said that Faraday was, in the years following, quite literally at play in the fields of the Lord. Mm-hmm. That was the way he thought. So that's one case where I think there is evidence that the actual concept of science did have some theological input. To say that was all, of course, would be nonsense, but some kind of input. The other one is in the question of paramagnetism of gases. Now, believing that all substances were not naturally or not actually paramagnetic, but they should show diamagnetic behaviour, Faraday, when he came back to London after some long while away, resumed studies with great vigour. What applied to solids should apply to gases and liquids. But his early results were very disappointing, and he got nowhere. Then he was stimulated by hearing of an Italian discovery of 1847 by Ancolari of the diamagnetism of flames, which are after all burning gas. And between then and 1851, in 4 years, he was able to repeat the Italian's findings. And not only did he succeed in showing that many common gases were diamagnetic, but that oxygen was actually paramagnetic. Today we know the reason why, but in those days unpaired electrons were not considered. Not only did he succeed in showing that, but he went on to formulate a theory of the Earth's magnetism that used the fact of oxygen's paramagnetism. We know that theory is quite wrong, but it did confirm the great interconnectedness of the whole universe scanned by science. And this behaviour of gases was related to the behaviour of the Earth in space. Now, this may have partly been a romantic legacy, but Pierce Williams, again, I quote him, he has no axe to grind in this, was probably right when he said, his strongly held belief in the unity of the forces of matter revealed his faith in the harmony of creation brought about by the beneficence of the Creator who made the whole universe to work together in harmony. Now, that's difficult, that, because one cannot prove these things, one can really comment, perhaps suggestively. Now I come to something very different, the communication of science. Faraday was one of the great science communicators, and his lectures must have been heard to be believed. He took immense trouble with them. He had help from a friend called McGrath. He went to elocution lessons. He had a stalwart assistant, Sergeant Anderson, to have cards labelled either slow or time, and I presume one of these will come up in a moment. And Faraday proceeded to do that and to obey those instructions. He deliberately avoided conventional mannerisms in rhetoric or convoluted logic. His prose was superbly simple and straightforward. In fact, he was reproducing the style of the best preachers in the Sandemanian Church, who showed none of the flourishes of even the greatest contemporary preachers like John Wesley. Faraday wrote full notes and he prepared his lectures in immense detail. Those of us who want to communicate science could do very much worse than read his Chemical History of a Candle, 1860 to 1861, still in print. Now, in his communication of science, Faraday showed a relentless logic. He was not merely didactic, telling the hearers what they should believe. That would be patronising, like short-term gains, but was unworthy of the speaker of the audience. What he did was to put before them the facts as he saw them, just as the Sandemanians, in their church services, put before their congregations the facts as they saw them, conclusions to be drawn from the Bible. The parallel between data in the scriptures and data in the laboratory was almost complete. A classic example of this critical rationality, which shows that Faraday was not an incredulous believer, was the devastating critique of the spiritualist phenomenon, which was very popular in those days, table turning, all that sort of thing. And in a lecture he gave to and also in a letter he wrote to the Athenaeum, he said this in 1853: "What a weak, credulous, incredulous, unbelieving, superstitious, bold, frightened, ridiculous world ours is, as far as concerns the mind of man. How full of inconsistencies, contradictions, and absurdities it is." So he kept his mind clear, and he certainly was not prepared just to accept the, as he would call it, spiritualist superstition. But his lectures received devastating praise from all who went to them. I just give you one quote. "No attentive listener ever came away from one of Faraday's lectures without having the limits of his spiritual vision enlarged and without feeling that his imagination has been stimulated to something beyond the expression of physical facts." And the connection between his communication of science and his faith is clear for all to see. But then, fourthly, the application of science. And Faraday was a great man for applying the science that he discovered. And we know all examples, many examples of that within electromagnetism. Let me give three others. First of all, to chemistry. Now, Faraday believed that the second chemical revolution which was the industrialization of chemistry, was meant to be for the benefit of human beings. He said the gifts of God are for our good, and the application of scientific laws was to enrich human welfare. And he did this in chemistry. He did this because this was his subject at first, and this was where everybody was working at that particular time. Chemistry in the early 19th century was the majority science in the popular mind. He undertook many small-scale analyses for industry. He got involved with litigation. He was much in demand for his chemical services outside the Royal Institution, and indeed it has been said that he was the greatest English chemist of his day. And he applied science to chemistry constantly. In gas manufacturing, metallurgy, and in many other cases. Also, there were in those days, sadly, a number of notorious mine explosions for all sorts of reasons, and particularly a dreadful one happened in 1844 in Haswell, County Durham. It left 95 dead, and Michael Faraday and Charles Lyell, the geologists, were called on by the Home Secretary to attend the inquest and offer expert advice. And this they did. They concluded a verdict of accidental death was due to a leakage of methane from a faulty safety lamp, and that the mine owners were not responsible. Now this has been rediscovered some 20 years ago by various people who have risen to condemn Faraday as being a capitalist lackey, determined under all circumstances not to blame the owners. And he's been hailed as a Tory preferring the status quo, unwilling to criticize established institutions. Now I want to mention this because I believe it is true that Faraday was unsympathetic to revolutionary politics. But to say he's a Tory is to ignore the roots, Sandemanian roots of his belief, which distanced itself from all political systems and wasn't afraid to criticise that most conspicuous feature of the establishment, the Church of England. No sound Tory would ever have done that in those days. And Cantor is much nearer the mark when he says that Faraday was a conservative by inclination, but not a Tory by persuasion. And his conclusions seem to rest upon the scientific evidence available, and of course it was Faraday who helped Davy in the development of the safety lamp to minimise mine explosions. This was some years before, of course. But again, science was applied for the benefit of mankind. I hurry on, for the time is rapidly passing. lighthouse operation. In 1836, Faraday was appointed as a scientific advisor to Trinity House. Now, these are the people who are in charge of the lighthouses of Great Britain, around our coasts. And he advised on ventilation, electric lights, heating oils, and so on and so forth. Now, I'll give you one example to show his dedication and his persistence. In 1860, he was due to examine one of the lighthouses. I think it was the North Foreland lighthouse, certainly a lighthouse in Kent. It had been a terrible winter, and snow was thick. Faraday was now approaching 70. He writes cheerfully, "On Friday, again I went to Dover, hoping to find the roads clear of snow. They were still blocked up towards the lighthouse, but by climbing over hedges, walls and fields, I succeeded in getting there and making the necessary inquiries and observations." That's septuagenarian as he nearly was, adventure was certainly something which shows the dedication and the commitment of this extraordinary man. But my final point concerns his lifestyle in science. Now, Faraday's lifestyle in science, of course, is something which will keep us here for many a long day. He was concerned to maintain the best possible personal relationships within science. He never criticized Humphrey Davy, who had treated him scurrilously, and he refused to accept presidency of the Royal Society despite a delegation, because both of these things were contrary to the deeply held faith that was Sandemanianism. You just did not criticize people behind their backs, and you just did not seek for worldly honours, including actually a knighthood. How far somebody as unworldly as Faraday could be happy to receive quite a generous income, about £1,000 per annum, has however raised questions. Well, he did feel underpaid at one stage, and there was a degree of unfairness and exploitation at the RI, but it was going through one of its many financial crises, so much can be forgiven. But he clearly felt he deserved adequate payment. But he wasn't overly committed to wealth, and indeed he hardly ever accepted the £200 offered by the Trinity House people for his work. He was committed to a biblical view of wealth, which included injunctions like "you cannot serve God and mammon, seek first the kingdom of God." And very interesting evidence about this comes from the study of Faraday's Bibles, two of which have been examined. They are well marked, and their markings suggest certain values that Faraday held very dearly. And there's a lot of marking about the love of money, a lot of marking about laying up for yourself treasure in heaven, and so on. And he and his fellow believers generally held to the view that money was an unworthy goal, but its acquisition was acceptable, acquired honestly, and in the pursuit of science, it was certainly an entirely fair thing to have and to receive. Now, the physicist John Tyndall asserted that by the 1830s, Faraday's income had dwindled to virtually nothing. And it's been said that he could earn £5,000 a year after 1832 had he wished. He never patented any of his inventions, and all this adds up to a consistent picture of a man who sat likely to worldly wealth. And so I have to come to my conclusion, for I don't want to inhibit a brief discussion, but my conclusion is that by the 1860s, Faraday, now into his 70s, was facing retirement. And various things had to go, his lectures, his Friday night discourse. The last one was given in 62. He resigned later from his leadership in the Sandemanian Church, and in 1865 stepped down from the position of superintendent at the Royal Institution and severed his connection with Trinity House. About this time, evolution was raising its head, but Faraday seems to have had no problem with it, and nothing is said. One short letter, however, he wrote in 1861, short before his death, to Auguste Larive, another scientist, discloses something of his inner strength. By now, things were collapsing around him. His memory was playing terrible tricks on him. He was physically infirm, but he drew immense strength from his faith. And he wrote to Larive this, not for public consumption, but from one friend to another. He spoke of the peace he enjoyed. Such peace is alone in the gift of God, and as it is He who gives it, why should we be afraid? His unspeakable gift in His beloved Son is the ground of no doubtful hope. This is a man whose science and religion were not in watertight compartments. And he spoke of his comfort in Christ, quoted passages from the Psalms. And then, in 1867, while sitting quietly in his chair, he died. 4 days later, in August, his funeral took place in Highgate Cemetery in North London. Only a few personal friends and close family were present. There was no ceremony of pomp. The body was not laid to rest in consecrated soil, for that was not commissioned in Scripture. And there was no religious service for the same reason. And he was buried in perfect silence. And at the head of the grave, a simple stone carries those words. His agnostic friend Tyndall gave his epitaph, "Just and faithful knight of God." Michael Faraday was in a class of his own. In the synthesis of science and Christianity, his strong confidence in the authority of Scripture, his simple faith in Christ. Faraday was typical of a great many gifted scientists before and then, and for them and for him, the task of scientific exploration was not only exciting and satisfying, in a very real sense, it was a Christian vocation.
Thank you very much, Colin. If we have time for some questions, yes, so please stay standing. And over to you for questions about Faraday. I'll take the chairman's prerogative on this one, I think. I wondered, Colin, if you could fill us in a little more. I was wondering, when you talked about his social relationships in science and the way he carried out his science against the backcloth of the way that people were doing science at the time, particularly, was there anything in the social structure of the Sandemanians, either by super-individualism or conversely the community of the Sandemanian church and so forth, that would have impacted on the way he structured his science? Or what was it, is it difficult to say?
The way he structured his science?
But the way he structured the practice of his science,
oh, right.
his experiments. I mean, was he a bit of a loner in his experiments, or was he, in terms of the way that science was done at that time?
Yes, I mean, I think he was a loner. He had an assistant, Sergeant Anderson, who worked for him, but he never really collaborated in any great detail with any of the great scientists of the day. He had, of course, collaborated with David, but then he was very much younger. He was a loner, and I think his individualism was promoted by the Sandemanians. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And his remark to his wife about his faith, between me and my God, shows just how individualistic and private a man he was. And I think that does apply to his faith, to his science. And he certainly didn't collaborate as we do nowadays. Or even as many of them did then.
Yes.
Would you say that he was perhaps partly driven by a desire to find the truth in his experiments?
Yes, I would. He explicitly said that.
He did?
Oh, yes. He was looking for the truth. Yes, which in our postmodernist day is a hard thing to swallow.
Yes.
But
was he also driven by a desire to communicate that truth to other people?
Yes. All his lectures make that absolutely clear. I mean, his lectures must have been fiery things. And he did all sorts of experiments. They were multimedia affairs. They weren't just talk. And at one stage, he threw a large coal bucket at the audience to make some particular point about electrostatic interaction. And he had the candle. I mean, the chemical history of the candle is a superb multimedia thing, because you look at the candle, you see how it's made, you see how it's used, you examine the structure of the flame, you learn about combustion, etc., etc., etc.
So would that have partly come from his faith?
I think so, yes. In that he was it was the same sort of thing. He loved to communicate. He was a preacher in the Scandinavian church in the end, and he loved to communicate, and be it there in Paul's Alley or in the RI, same thing.
Yes.
I wonder what you would make of current science, with the fights are going on these days.
You
Do you approve of them all? What do you think?
What do you make of current science?
Yes. The
Well,
SETI project, DNA structure, that sort of thing.
that is not a question that any historian could possibly answer. It's so speculative.
Yes.
Could I say how much I enjoyed your talk, Colin? I thought it was wonderful and inspiring. A few comments which reinforce almost everything that you said. You quoted Pierce Williams in his admirable biography of Faraday, and I think you quoted it as saying that the strongly held belief in the unity of the forces of nature. You may remember that when Faraday made the sensational discovery of the magneto-optic effect, where a magnetic field turns the plane of polarization of light, within a day he wrote a paper either for Philosophical Magazine or Trans, and it starts with those memorable words: "I have long held an opinion amounting almost to conviction that all the various forces of nature have one common origin," and so on. And then he talks about Joul's experiment, well, he didn't name Joule, but the relationship between the mechanical equivalent heat and so forth. Could I also mention a couple of other points? The question was asked by Dr. Alexander about his attitude to other scientists and so forth. You may also remember that when Tyndall came back from the British Association meeting at Oxford and told Faraday how distasteful it was to observe certain scientists at one another's throats, arguing deeply, and he felt that this was ungracious and uncivilized. I can't remember the precise words, but I can remember one part of the reply on the advice that Faraday gave. He says, "I've always found in my long life that when people are critical of you, be dull of apprehension." That was, I think, a wonderful thing. Be dull and ignore it. And if they're kind, then pounce upon it, and so on. And the last thing I'd like to say, the book of Job was he marked his Bible in many places, as you rightly pointed out. But in the 9th chapter of the book of Job, I think the 20th verse, I've quoted it so many times: "If I justify myself, my own mouth shall condemn me. If I say I am perfect, it shall make me perverse." He never criticized other people, except on occasional battles he had with some Italians and so forth. And he was always hypercritical of his own work. So it's wonderful reinforcement. I'm glad to have come and listen to you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I was going to talk about Job, I didn't have time, but it was his, according to the markings in his Bible, his favourite book. And of course, Joel not only talks about the frailty of human beings, which it certainly does, but also about the glory of nature, the last 4 chapters. And those two things so much integrate into Faraday's own work. It's not hard to see why he liked Job.
Well, I think we could carry potentially this discussion and questions on for a long time, but we really have to finish at 2 o'clock for several different reasons. So again, we'd just like to thank Colin Russell very much indeed for a really fascinating talk and opening our eyes to a really interesting man and career. And we're so glad again that we've named our institute after Michael Faraday. We're even more glad after hearing that talk. So thank you, Colin, very much indeed.